Hey, Gleb here. In this chapter of the cinematic lighting course for Blender, we'll set up this type of low-key, dramatic interior lighting in an otherwise pretty bland environment to make the cinematic factor of this shot go to 11. And we'll do it in Eevee, Blender's real-time render engine, going step by step through a build-up of lighting components such as ambient fill, pools of sunlight soften up with the area lights. Keeping the light motivation in mind at all stages of our workflow, we will then make a deeper dive into the global illumination techniques, both real-time and pre-baked, such as Irradiance Map and even some SSGI, or screen space global illumination magic to achieve the higher levels of realism and expressiveness in Blender's Eevee, as close to real-time as possible. Without a further delay, let us get started. To start the ball rolling, it is worth taking a look at the location we're gonna be lighting following the best practices and techniques from the previous chapters. It is a photoscanned corridor consisting of 3 sections put together. By the way, a shameless plug here would make sense, I think. We have a complete course on creating photoscanned assets like this, using reality capture and Blender on Creative Shrimp, so check it out if you like. This model is one of the demo assets we create in this course step by step, so I thought you may want to check it. Alright, the end of the ad. So back to our Blender scene with the photoscanned corridor ready to be lit. There are some windows and a hole in the roof that will serve as natural motivation for artificial lights we're gonna put in there. It also has an animated camera which we'll use for fly-through. If you'd like to follow along and practice lighting techniques together, make sure to grab the project file from the course resources. Okay, what's our lighting plan? What do we plan to do? What's even going on there? Often the environment itself can offer a superb motivation for what to do with lighting, with artificial lighting I mean, and where to take it, so we can base creative decisions on something that actually makes sense. Here I thought that the hole in the roof will serve as the natural motivation for our key light, so I blocked the door openings on the right side to focus on that hole and some other windows through which the sunshine or an overcast skylight can seep through, leaving the pools of bright hotness here and there for that sort of, high contrast dramatic look. So that, I think, is our motivation for what we're gonna do with lights here. Let's get started. I cannot stress enough how important it is to set a blank canvas first and get straight to the key light or main light. Thankfully in 3D we don't have to do much. We don't have to wait till night for the ambient spill to dry down. We have a totalitarian control over pretty much anything right away. Okay, the way I work, the top view is usually reserved for the material preview, which is gonna be our unlit view with no scene or world lights, but just the default HDRI to illuminate everything kind of evenly. The bottom view, though, is our actual rendered view straight from the camera perspective. It is rendered in real time using Eevee, so it should be nice and fast, although not as realistic out of the box as Cycles. But hopefully we'll see some workarounds. So by default there is some ambient light that you can change in the World tab. It's a grayish uniform fill that isn't particularly realistic without baking the global illumination and all the jazz. You can leave a tiny amount of it or zero it out completely to get a clean slate or an empty void for our key light to begin with. Alright, time for the key light, at least its first and major component, the sun coming through the opening in our roof. For that we can use the sun lamp obviously, but I'll stick with the spotlight to better control its influence and avoid the light leaks that could show up with the sun lamp. Light leaks basically look like this. Not that it is something we should be afraid of. Actually, I will show a fix a bit later on in this video. Okay, so let's stick with the spotlight for now. So I'm pressing G to move, R to rotate it to point it out into the corridor. It should be a source with a respectable wattage, maybe around 10k watts for that spread. So we've got that kind of pool of light that will be the focal point of the whole image due to the way it's placed and how bright it is. 10k watts is not a joke. Alright, now I think I'll reintroduce a little bit of a fill to just better gauge the contrast levels early on. And now in the light settings, I'll tinker around with the size of the spotlight to shrink the pool of light down somewhat, like that. And I'll keep fine-tuning its look, namely its color and intensity, keeping the dynamic range in mind. Depending on the time of the day and the white balance in camera, the sun can have a pretty low color temperature, which pushes it towards a deep orange, or if it's more of a midday situation or early evening, it'll probably be a more neutral peachy color. As for the power in watts, in addition to brightness, it also affects the bloom effect. The higher values trigger in more bloom, technically, so it's a matter of dynamic range. For example, there can be many light spots in the image, but only the sunlight, if you want it to look really intense, will have the bloom effect because of the wattage. That's the thing. Alright, so I think giving it 40k watts should give it enough punch to make it look like a real sun, especially coupled with a bloom effect. But I'll temporarily switch the bloom off though, and we'll go to the spotlight settings and enable contact shadows for the higher amount of detail in the shadowy areas. Our sun should probably come in from some other windows and openings as well, or at least it could, as long as it makes for interesting contrasts of light versus dark. So what I'm gonna do is rename this light, of course, and then Shift D to duplicate it to create one more spotlight. I think that door should be a nice place to let the sunshine in, so I'm moving it there. It looks great, I think, compositionally as the secondary point of interest, so that's why I'm choosing that door instead of some other door nearby. I see some glitches in the shadows. Interesting. I think the way to fix it is to come over to the contact shadow settings and increase the distance a bit. And maybe thickness as well. Alright, so this is the second key light imitating the sun. We have one more window at the end of the corridor though, so I'm gonna duplicate this light once more and move it there. I'm changing the angle ever so slightly, but nobody will notice it anyway, so we can do it. We can do whatever we want. It will create one more point of interest once the camera moves there. So basically we're distributing the contrast across the scene to make sure there's always the contrast of bright versus dark going on at all camera positions pretty much. Now I'll boost the power of this light as well, as I know in advance it'll be cool to have more secondary bounces there, which will enable later on in this tutorial. So I'm multiplying the power by 2 and scrolling our animation back to the first frame, or to the frame 0 rather. So what we achieved with our key light is these areas of local brightness scattered around our composition or our shot in the way that feels interesting and creates nice overall contrast. Now it looks kind of funky because there is nothing yet to really motivate this bright sunlight, as in a brighter patch of sky or something, so we go, oh, there's a really high exposure outside, probably a midday, that kind of thing. As for the light placement, our key light could come in from the far window mostly, hitting the floor and the left wall and spreading out from there. It could work too, as it would still be an upstage light in the sense that we would still shoot into shadows and see those nice shaded areas for a nice light pattern, as described in the first chapter of this course. Or it could have been a bigger, softer light coming in from that direction as an alternative. We would still get a cool zebra pattern of light to dark to light to dark, which always looks three-dimensional and cinematic from that formal perspective. This was some mumbo-jumbo on the key light direction. Next, let's talk about the key versus fill ratio. The next logical step after nailing the main light is to choose the amount of the fill light. The ratio between the sunspots and the ambient light, or the secondary bounces for that matter, is our basic contrast. It is a creative choice to be made early on in the process, or at any point really, but I prefer to establish the contrast ratio early, as it's a major part of the whole look. How tense do we want our lighting setup to feel? Higher fill levels can feel more serene and, what is the right word there, neutral? More relaxed in some way, while still remaining the supporting actor in comparison to the key light, even at such exposures. I think I'm gonna go with the more dramatic rendition though, to create an impression of a really striking sunlight, almost like we haven't fully adapted to its levels really, to make our dungeon feel mysterious and murky by the contrast. It is a matter of going low-key, with a lower overall amount of light at play at a much harsher contrast ratio of 20:1 and higher, or high-key, where the image is generally brighter with a much lower contrast ratio of, let's say, 2 or 3:1, something in that ballpark. These are purely creative choices, or at some point it may become a narrative choice given what needs to be hidden or delivered to the viewer, but mostly creative and even formal choice anyway. As I've said, I'm gonna go with a low-key look for this one though. The Diablo Cathedral Dungeon type of look. I sense death within this place. That sort of stuff. Well, maybe slightly more cheerful. One thing still missing from our setup is the motivation for the sunlight. A visible kind of natural source, a patch of the sky or something. Let's add a new collection called sky_01, and then place our 3D cursor there, go Shift A, and add in a plane. I will translate this plane so it covers the opening, like that. The renaming stuff must go on, so let's give it some proper name. Now I'm gonna give it a new material as well. It should obviously be the emission one. So it won't necessarily throw the light into our corridor, it'll just imitate a brighter exposure outside, and it'll be enough. We'll add an extra area light to shovel some softness in a bit later, but for now, let's give this one a slightly bluish tint, and the strength of, I don't know, 3 point something should be good. It depends on how much bloom do we want it to generate. I'm not a huge fan of the over-the-top effects, so I'm settling at the strength of 3, alright? It also shouldn't cast shadows, so the shadow mode should be set to none in the material properties. As for the backface culling, it would be nice to see through this plane from the outside, but it seems that the plane should probably face the other direction to be invisible from the outside and not vice versa. Let me rotate it by 180 degrees like that. Cool. No obstruction from the outside now. The magic of the flipped normals for you. Nice. We still have a few more openings to support, so we can repeat the steps by duplicating this plane a few times. Now tackling the back window first. Here we go. Moving on. Yeah, that door should be covered as well, but actually I'll block it with a duplicate of one of our blockers with a black shader. The thing about this particular blocker though is that it should allow the light to pass through it, paradoxically. So I'm gonna come over to the Materials tab now and assign a new shader to it. A shadeless shader it will be, and switching the shadow type from the opaque to none. Alright, it worked. It should look way more grounded and motivated now with these panels, right? The pieces are coming together nicely. With adding the sun, it's not over. Next, we need to simulate a soft light from the sky shining through that opening. You can think of it like this. Imagine that the opening itself is a light source, technically an area light, placed just outside on the other side. For that, we'll need one more collection to keep it clean, and an area light indeed. Let's go Shift A, light, area. The point is to resize that light to cover that opening roughly. Okay, so this is our sky underscore light underscore 01. Let me hide the pesky UI elements for a moment to focus on the image. So, how powerful should it be? There is definitely a certain proportion between the sun and the sky which should feel natural within a certain range. I usually trust my subjective judgment when it comes to light ratios, and it would be nice to maintain the overall contrast we've set. So maybe 150 watts would be okay, with a bluish tint simulating the sky temperature as well. Alright, now we have a bit of softness and a bit of directionality, sculpting the shapes of the bricks and everything in a more defined way. Let's not forget about the contact shadows, and we should be good. Speaking about shadows, the whole area light thing won't work without these soft shadows turned on in the Eevee settings. Soft shadows is definitely one of those features of Eevee that brings it a step closer to ray-traced rendering, and a pretty big step closer. It's a must-have, definitely. Here is a quick comparison, if only we needed one. There are still a few more points to push our skylight through, so next we're gonna go through it really quickly. I'm gonna press Shift D and drag it to the other one, namely to the blocker that has the shadow casting capability turned off, sizing it roughly to the shape of the door. Okay, skylight 02 it will be. Look at this beautiful diffuse light hitting that right wall. Can it be stronger if it's so beautiful? I don't know. Probably the answer is negative. I don't think so. Again, eyeballing the ratio with the less is more mantra in mind. Next, I'm going to create the third light for the smaller window at the back. I want this one to be approximately as strong as the others, though I'm trying to make it slightly stronger to see if it works better. Again, probably I'll keep it slightly more subdued. Something like that. We'll achieve the difference in the exposures between the sections in a slightly different way later on, with the help of the fog, basically. Alright, one thing that is kind of missing yet, and to show it better, I'll dim down the ambient light. So one thing that is still missing is the secondary light bounces, aka GI, aka global illumination. Of course, we have our soft lights looking fairly believable, so on and so forth, and the environment's ambience to fake the indirect lighting to some extent. But if you ask me, it can definitely be faked in a much more convincing way, which is on our list, and we'll get to it in just a moment. So what have we done so far? We've got the warmer sun, with the addition of the softer bluish light from the sky panels, connoting the midday or early evening, but technically we can make it look like there's an overcast sky outside, and it's drizzling, perhaps, and a storm is brewing, if you have a good imagination. Just kidding. Anyway, what I wanted to say is that the light ratios and temperatures can be played with for connoting a different time and weather, like a sunset, for example. The main thing though is that while we have the basic lighting setup finished, all major things done, really, the key, the softer key components, some ambience, some light fall-off going, contrasts, all good, it would still be extremely cool to get the light transport going, as our sun hits the walls to make it bounce around and so forth. We need to either fake it or make it in terms of the global illumination in Eevee. If you know me, my go-to technique is to try to fake it first. So the first method of simulating, or rather faking global illumination in Eevee that we'll explore is using good old point lights as a substitute of the secondary bounces. So I'm creating a new collection, proudly named Fake GI, killing the environment fill so it doesn't mix with what we are about to do, and then adding a point light where the sun rays collide with the wall. This light is supposed to imitate the rays reflected off that wall. It shouldn't be too obvious. Again, the light ratios are easily breakable. If in doubt, less is more. I'm eyeballing it as usual. Also, the secondary bounces should inherit the color of the light that hit it, multiplied by the color of the surface. So I'm changing its color to a reddish, orangish mixture. To better see it, I'll toggle the skylight off as well. So basically, that is the sunlight and our fake bounce. One thing is missing though. The photons shouldn't lose energy passing through the space, so the custom distance should be turned on and changed to a much higher value. Like 40 meters or 80 or more. It'll make it look just like the Cycles light fall off, which is a good thing. Okay, now we can fake the GI bounces for the rest of the sources. Copying this guy out to fake the GI elsewhere. Where should it be? Probably emanating right from that shiny rectangle on the floor. It looks satisfying. The technique from the ancient times still usable. Very, very nice. Alright, and one more in that far room, I think. Shift D. Moving it all the way to the door frame of that back room, near that pool of light. What do you think? How far can we push it in terms of the light's strength? It's always a matter of finding a good looking but also realistic light ratio. It's easily breakable, as we have mentioned. Okay, the fake GI looks pretty good. Surprisingly good, I'd say. I will probably smuggle in one more fake light there near the door, probably with a slightly higher radius for a softer light, and a more neutral color as well, slightly closer towards white, just to crank up the exposure in this area ever so slightly. The fake omnis have been placed. Now let's have a look at the whole package. For the clarity's sake, I'll get rid of the bloom temporarily. It looks like it adds something to the GI though. Anyway, where's our skylight? By the way, I have just realized that I didn't turn on the custom distance for the area lights. Let's fix it really quickly. I'm gonna set it to 80 meters. And for the second light as well. Click 80. As we have the fake GI now set up, I'll drop the sky strength a touch to compensate it, I think. By now I realized out of a sudden that we can use one more Omni light in the far section of the corridor with the cooler color and a much higher exposure, imitating the diffused window light bouncing around that small room multiple times. And again, to create one more layer of lighting, so this room has generally higher exposure, which will definitely contribute to the cinematic depth, the difference in exposures between the light spaces, let's say. That is the fifth and the last element of our fake GI bounces. I'm gonna turn this one down just a little bit, but still maintaining that crucial difference. Okay, that looks good. That was the first way to imitate global illumination in Eevee while sticking to 100% real-time techniques. I think it looks really convincing, especially if we bring back some amount of the ambient light. Gonna give it a brownish tint to imitate some of that earthy tone of the bricks as well. Very cool indeed. Now gonna press Shift Space to play the camera fly-through animation. And it concludes the first GI technique and the base lighting setup for this location. Where is my coffee again? As a quick recap, in this chapter of the cinematic lighting course, we were setting up a low-key dramatic interior lighting in an otherwise not super impressive location to push the cinematic qualities as far as we can. The first global illumination technique we tried was to use the fake secondary bounces, and it worked. But in the next video we will go deeper and try a more advanced and a more realistic one. If your Eevee lights won't be animated, then a baked irradiance map becomes an interesting solution to the GI problem. It is a breeze to set up, doesn't consume a lot of resources. What's not to like? Except it can't be animated, or at least easily animated. As usual, it starts with a new collection for the irradiance map, and then we'll need the irradiance volume itself. Shift A, light probe, irradiance volume. The settings for the volume can be found in this menu. I'll keep it open. What we can do next is scale this volume roughly to the shape of our corridor. I'm doing it in the orthographic modes. Just use the numbers on the numpad. Something like that. So it roughly occupies the same space as the corridor. Now we have a bunch of parameters that can be tweaked. The intensity is probably the most interesting one. I'll skip it for now and have a look at the resolution instead. Basically, the higher the density of points and the more uniform the distribution, the better the result. As a rule of thumb. So I'm scaling the X resolution all the way to 20, so the distribution of dots in the volume looks more or less uniform and fairly dense too. With the domain setup, we can give it a try and bake our secondary light bounces. For the sake of clarity, I'll switch off every light, except our spotlights perhaps, including the ambient fill, so we are left with the light blobs from the spotlights only, everything else pitch black due to no real light transport happening. Just these three light sources. So moving on to the irradiance volume settings, let's first try the default intensity of 1 for the light bounces, the vanilla GI. Down in the render settings, I'm trying to find the bake button in the indirect lighting tab. Here it is, rock and roll. It usually doesn't take long, and it looks pretty awesome already with a little glitch at the top that I'll try to fix via scaling the domain. Maybe something like that. Or maybe the other way around. Yeah, even though the difference is fairly minor, I think it's better now. I wonder if you agree, it's such an injection of realism, this baked irradiance map. I find it quite fascinating. If you want more global illumination for aesthetic reasons, it can be multiplied by a factor of whatever, 3 for example, and rebaked. It is way more aggressive now, up to the point of looking a little bit stylized. Maybe not yet, but getting close. But it's definitely a viable option anyway. A quick comparison, this is no GI whatsoever. This is how the default irradiance intensity looks. And this is the irradiance that is 3x stronger. I like a more natural and subdued look, I think. And here's how it compares to the fake GI look. Actually, the fun part is that we can use the fake Omni lights in conjunction with baking. Who said that we cannot? The question is, how would it work together? Without a hitch, really. Nothing prevents us from using these two techniques combined. I think I'd still prefer to have the default bounces multiplier. Let me rebake the lighting really quickly. So before switching on the fake lights, it looks like that. A quick disclaimer, I love how it looks right out of the box. The light transport makes wonders, really. For the experimentation's sake, I'll delete our lighting cache though. Toggle on the skylight and the fake GI. So it looks like that, with the fake point lights scattered around. And now let's do a quick rebake. Probably no big difference with these extra lights toggled on. Maybe the most prominent change is the extra amount of exposure in the far room, elevating the levels there, and some extra fill here and there in the shadows. That is it. Feel free to play with the power of these extra lights to fine-tune the balance. So listen to your heart when tweaking the light ratios. I think that we no longer need to have the irradiance volume visible in the viewport, so let's untick its visibility box. And here we go! Shift space runs the camera animation, and you can see that the baked radiance makes it a million times more realistic. And when it's coupled with the strategically or tactically placed contrasts and highlights, I will be honest with you, one of the things that brought me into computer graphics was irradiance simulation in one of the old days render engine. Nostalgia. Anyways, the settings in the indirect lighting tab don't do an awful lot. Even tweaking the cube map size and so on has practically very little effect on the quality of the GI. So there is no point in touching it yet. If there is one thing that does affect the quality, it is for sure the X, Y, and Z resolution within the irradiance volume settings. Cranking up these guys to a reasonable amount that is more or less dense does have the effect on the look indeed, just like this quick comparison shows, I believe. So that was the second indirect lighting technique that has a number of cool benefits, like it's super easy to set up, it looks convincing, but it cannot be easily animated though, without using Python at least. Because the irradiance volume would have to be recalculated each frame, perhaps even making it not much faster than cycles at that point. But even the static irradiance volume looks sleek though, and its indirect light does illuminate the objects that are within the irradiance volume boundaries, which is a nice touch, even dynamic objects. What can we do with the animated lights though? Or if we just want a fully real-time GI in Eevee, is it even possible? Fortunately, there is a real-time GI method for Blender's Eevee called SSGI or Screen Space Global Illumination. It exists as a free add-on so far and it has its own limitations, but when it works, oh it works. And works brilliantly for animations with the light changing direction and all that stuff. Even material lights for that matter. It supports the emission materials. Join me in this tutorial to walk together through the basics of using SSGI instead of baking irradiance map or faking it with Omni lights. You can find Blender with SSGI patch for Eevee on blender.community/graphicall. It is a completely free add-on, fairly easy to use, and it does look great when it works. The secondary light bounces it simulates actually look really convincing. The primary light should always be plus-minus on screen for this effect to work, which is a major limitation though. But yeah, irradiance volumes also have their issues. They don't work when the lights are changing. You can see that the cache still lingers after moving the light source. So let's clear the lighting cache as a goodwill gesture, showing our readiness to try real-time SSGI. To not water down the SSGI effect, we can isolate our key light, as it will have the most powerful secondary light reflections with most influence. Oh, do you have the soft shadows on? It should be on, just as a quick reminder. So where was I? Yeah, in the SSGI Blender build there is a new tab called Screen Space Ray Tracing. It is as cool as it sounds, and this one checkbox enables all the SSGI magic. There is a lot of settings there in the SSGI settings, I use just one most of the time. Its intensity, the amount of global illumination. Cranking up the GI bounces is a guilty pleasure for sure, trading the rules of physics for a visual punch. But why not? It can be 2 or 3 or whatever times as much irradiance as we want, really. The SSGI can be a bit splotchy on render, so to be on the safe side, I'll boost the render samples to 128. It is worth emphasizing, once again, that the setting that has the most effect on the global illumination look is the intensity slider, which is now set to 3, meaning that both the power and the saturation of the secondary light bounces got multiplied by that factor. SSGI, like any other such technique, has its strong and weak sides. When it works, it is a pure magic. When the primary light influence, like these hotspots from our spotlights or the opening in the roof, are visible on screen, and I'm adding an emphasis here, on screen, within the frame, then SSGI does generate the beautiful real-time secondary bounces, or indirect illumination. It works beautifully for the emissive materials as well, just like cycles from that perspective. That is quite liberating. There is a caveat though. It works as long as the light source primary influence is within the frame, or simply speaking, doesn't work if the camera is facing the opposite direction. Like as soon as we turn away from the light, the indirect lighting is gone. That's why the technique is called screen space after all, so that's quite a limitation which can be a deal breaker for sure, but it is how it is. It is important to understand it's a screen space effect rather than a world space light transport. I think it's worth mentioning that aside from the intensity slider in the SSGI settings, there are other things affecting the indirect lighting, such as intensity of the light itself, surprise. Obviously, the stronger the light, the stronger its bounce. It is also worth factoring in for sure. Another thing worth taking in consideration is that it may also interact with exposure in some interesting ways. For example, if we make the sun power absurdly strong, let's say by giving it a killer 400,000 watts, then offset the exposure to compensate, it'll interestingly reduce the amount of indirect bounces significantly. I thought this is interesting and worth keeping in mind while tweaking those things. I'll roll it back to exposure 0 and the power of just 40k for now though. Alright, that looks amazing. And it wasn't that hard to set the SSGI real-time indirect lighting, right? Definitely not much more complicated than the other solutions, maybe aside from installing the add-on, which shouldn't be a big issue, I hope. There are certain limitations, of course, just like with anything. I'm pretty happy with how it worked in this shot though. There are a few final touches to be made to polish the whole lighting setup here, so why don't we do it right away? The small-scale surface details isn't something that hybrid rasterization engines like Eevee excel at doing. There are the workarounds though, such as ambient occlusion effect, that adds shadow details in the occluded areas like corners and piles of bricks and all that stuff. So to preview the ambient occlusion, I'll click this arrow to get to the render passes menu, then enable ambient occlusion preview. The effect itself is located in the render tab, awaiting for activation. The factor is how intense the shading should be in crevices. It can be higher than 1. It doesn't necessarily have to, as it starts looking funky. The distance is how wide the darkening spreads out from these crevices and recessed areas. Okay, let's return now to the combined view and see how ambient occlusion looks there. 5 feels like an overkill. Way too much occlusion, really. 2 is a more natural attenuation, as for me. So, ambient occlusion gave us some extra shading details on top of the GI, and that should make it resemble ray-traced light transport even more, which is obviously a good thing if we aim at the cinematic and at the same time realistic results. Now there are a few more knobs to be tweaked. The bloom filter, of course, to help the really hot areas pop, simulating the dispersion in the lens. I don't like a dreamy vibe, as you know, which is too obviously blooming. So I keep the threshold reasonable, so it picks up only the truly hot pixels. Like the hot pixels. The pixels the camera can handle. Then, of course, the screen space ray tracing is the hero of this show, the SSGI lighting, with the intensity slider open to adjustment. Which makes me think that modesty is a good thing and we should probably reduce the intensity a bit. 3 feels a bit too much. 2 feels reserved but still committed. Way to go. Then, ironically, this technique can also work with the extra point lights we used to fake GI. What else? The soft shadows, like we mentioned before, is yet another must-have feature. And lastly, the view transform should be filmic, obviously. As simple as that. So the scene-referred light is transferred to our displays using a film emulsion-like tonal curve. The standard view transform just cannot compete with it in terms of, well, filmic, cinematic qualities like the absence of hard clipping. Okay, filmic then. Then lastly we have the base looks or base contrast presets to choose from, which are quite fundamental to the image formation. I'm pretty conservative in choosing the medium contrast route most of the time, and this time as well. I think it covers more or less everything we wanted to do at that point with Eevee settings. The last minute tweak, that is last because I forgot about it, whoops, is to add the audience favorite volume light with the help of the principled BSDF shader. So a new collection gets dropped, it'll be haze. Then we'll need a cube to fill with the volume material, scaling it up to the boundaries of the corridor like that, even slightly larger to play it safe, then naming it and opening the materials tab with this object still selected. Clicking the new button, Shift F3 for the shader editor, and what we do next is replacing the default material with the principled volume, which in turn gets hooked up to the second input that says volume. As soon as we get sensible with the density slider, the sun shafts should show up. Still in a super thick fog. What I'm looking for is something not as dramatic for sure. So density should go down considerably. But for now, I'll just leave it at 0.1 to showcase the anisotropy. The higher anisotropy, as we remember, reveals the fake sources by kind of attracting the volume material to where they are, which looks a bit funky. The way to avoid it is to keep it somewhere around 0. It's still too dusty. I'm reducing the density to about 0.01. Okay, congrats on striking a cinematic lighting bingo. Cannot think of anything else to cover. We pretty much completed the tutorial at that point, and I want to say thank you for watching. Maybe the last thing worth getting out of the way is the light animation. We won't go into much detail. We'll just set up some quick light sweep and call it a day. A crucial difference between SSGI and other GI methods in Eevee that rely on baking is being able to animate the lights. Let's show it really quickly without diving into details. So I'm gonna hide every light except maybe the sun and the sky to better see the SSGI bounces, really. And then what I want to do is make it look like the sun is going down, sliding down that wall, or vice versa, rising up. In order to do that, I'm gonna jump in the timeline all the way to frame, for example, 130. And with the Sun 01 selected, I go I and set the rotation keyframe there. Now jumping back to the start of the animation, I'm gonna rotate the light like this, or maybe like that, just a small amount of travel, like whoosh, then I and insert the rotation keyframe again. I've just noticed after seeing the animation that there is a spectacular light leak on the left wall. How to doctor it, I wonder. Maybe increased thickness in the contact shadows may help with that. Yeah, it seems that it gets the job done. Which is great. No more glitches. I think that the second light would enjoy a bit of travel as well. The sun doesn't stand still at the Iron Hill today. So back to beginning with the second light selected. Let's rotate it like this. Eye, rotation, all the way then to frame 200. R to rotate, keyframe the rotation again. Then scrolling back, shift space to play the animation. And it looks good to me. It was a super basic animation that still shows the potential of SSGI as the technique that allows for that kind of animation. Of course, there are so many things that can be animated, like the light color or whatever else, perhaps even exposure to keyframe the eye or the camera adaptation to light. There are so many possibilities, really. We have just scratched the surface with this technique. Thank you so much for sticking to the end of this video. We have just talked about the SSGI real-time global illumination method for Blender, for Eevee, and how it compares to other GI methods like irradiance maps or fake point lights. In this section, we went through the process of setting up lighting in interior spaces, focusing on the expressive cinematic qualities that can be infused into such otherwise not very evocative location. As in all other tutorials from this course, I hope you'll enjoy applying the techniques and principles of that video to your own projects that involve similar lighting challenges. It was the cinematic lighting course for 3D artists. My name is Gleb Alexandrov. Can't wait to see your results. In the next chapter of cinematic lighting in Blender, we'll pass it over to Cycles once again and explore the layers of light in this moody warehouse environment, aiming for maximum realism and wow factor. So gonna grab a cup of coffee and we'll be right back.